children. A man's weekly wage on the logging camps north of Kenora in 1887 was about $12. $12 bought you flour, salt pork, and enough lamp oil to last a month if you were careful about it. It bought you a new pair of wool socks and maybe a bottle of rye on Saturday night if the foreman hadn't docked your pay for some invented infraction. $12 was not supposed to buy a woman's life, children. But that was exactly what Emmett Pryce paid for Sable done on a Thursday evening in October, children, when the frost was already hard enough to crack the mud on the road outside Callaway's supply, and the wind off Lake of the Woods had teeth that drew blood. He hadn't planned it, children. That was the part he would struggle to explain to himself for months afterward. Lying awake on his bunk in the dark, listening to the birch trees creak and groan against each other in the cold, children. He had ridden into Kenora for nails, lamp oil, and a new draw knife. He had stopped at Callaway's because it was the only place in town that carried the right gauge of blade. He had not planned anything beyond that. The noise hit him before he got through the door. Callaway's on a Thursday night was a particular breed of miserable children. The supply post doubled as a trading floor and a drinking establishment, and a place where men who had been alone in the bush for too long came to remind themselves that other human beings existed, children. The air was thick with pipe smoke and the smell of wet wool and the particular sourness of men who hadn't bathed since September. Emmett was not a man who enjoyed crowds, children. He was a man who had chosen a life on 47 acres of bush and rock north of the town specifically to avoid them, children. He kept his shoulders drawn in and his eyes on the floor and moved toward the back counter where old Harland Callaway was supposed to be. He heard her before he saw anything. Not crying, children. That was what stopped him. Most women in trouble cried, and a man could tell himself it wasn't his business and walk around it. This was different. This was the sound of a woman not crying, children, which is a far more deliberate thing and far harder to ignore. He looked up, children. There was a man near the wood stove that Emmett vaguely recognized as a debt collector who worked the northern camps, a thick-necked man named Aldous, who smelled of bear grease and had the kind of flat, pale eyes that registered everything and felt nothing, children. Aldous had his fist wrapped around a length of rope, and the rope was tied around the wrists of a young woman who was standing in front of him with her chin level and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, children, as though she had decided to be somewhere else entirely inside her own head. She looked to be somewhere around 20, children. It was hard to tell with certainty because she was thin in the way that spoke of long deprivation rather than natural build, and the bruising along her jaw had aged her face, children. She wore a cotton dress that had been good once, maybe 2 summers ago, and a man's coat that was 3 sizes too large and missing its buttons, held closed across her chest with her bound wrists, children. Her feet were in boots at least. That was something, children. Aldous was talking to a group of men who had gathered the way men gather when something awful is happening, and they have decided their presence is entertainment rather than complicity. $12, children, I said, children. Girl's got 2 good hands and a back that works. She can cook, she can carry, she can clean. $12, and she's your problem instead of mine. Emmett set down the list he'd been carrying in his coat pocket. He didn't look at it again. He didn't stride across the room. He was not a striding man, children. He walked the way he walked everywhere, with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who had learned that most things could be approached calmly, children, even the things that made your blood go hot and strange in your chest. He stopped in front of Aldous. He was not a small man. The logging years had seen to that. He met Aldous's flat, pale eyes and held them. Children, how much did you say? It wasn't a question. Aldous looked him over. $12, friend, children. You hard of hearing or just slow? Emmett reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He had $18 on him. The nails and the draw knife and the lamp oil would have to wait. He pulled out the folded bills and pressed 12 of them into Aldous' chest without breaking eye contact. The bills fluttered against the man's coat. Let go of the rope. The room had gone quiet. Aldous stared at the money. Children. Something moved behind those flat eyes, a quick calculation, the kind that only ever concerns itself with self-interest. Then he released the rope. Emmett turned to the woman. He did not look at the crowd. Children. Come on, he said. And then, because he genuinely did not know what else to say, he said nothing else. He just walked toward the door and hoped she would follow. She did. The cold outside was absolute. Children. It hit them both like a wall. Children. Emmett's breath came out in a hard white cloud, and he stopped on the step, working through what had just happened, with the slow, methodical part of his brain that dealt with practical problems. He had a horse. Children. He had 37 kilometers of bad road between him and his homestead. He had a woman standing behind him in a buttonless coat who was attached to nothing, and no one that he knew of. He turned around. Children. She was looking at him, not with gratitude, not with fear, exactly. Children. She was looking at him the way you look at a problem you haven't solved yet. Her eyes were very dark brown, almost black in the low light off the door. Children. And they were tracking him the way a person tracks something they haven't decided to trust. I'm Emmett Pryce, he said. I've got a homestead north of town. Children. You can ride up with me, or I can leave you money for the hotel on Mather Street. Your choice. She said nothing for a moment. Children. Then, Sable. Her voice was rougher than he expected, low and a little hoarse, like someone who hadn't spoken much in a long time. My name is Sable. She looked at the road. She looked back at him. I'll ride, she said. He nodded and went to untie his horse. They rode north in silence. Emmett had a big gray mare named Patience, well named, who tolerated the double weight without complaint. Children. He rode behind, and Sable sat in front, and she held herself rigidly upright for the first several kilometers against him, enduring the proximity with her spine straight and her jaw set. He could feel the tension in her like a wire pulled too tight. He didn't comment on it. He kept his hands on the reins and his eyes on the dark road and let the silence be what it needed to be. Children. The homestead was a clearing cut into black spruce and poplar, with a cabin that Emmett had built over 3 winters, adding to it each year as time and lumber allowed. Children. There was a barn for Patience and the 2 other horses and the milk cow, a root cellar dug into the hill, a smokehouse, a woodlot, a kitchen garden now frozen solid and skeletal under the first frost. Children. It was not beautiful in the way that things in stories are beautiful. Children. It was functional and quiet, and it was his, and he had arranged it specifically around the needs of a man who preferred to think and work in silence. He brought Patience into the barn and unsaddled her. Children. Sable stood in the doorway and watched him work without offering to help, which he took as a reasonable response under the circumstances. When he finished, he walked past her toward the cabin. Children. And she followed him in. The inside was cold. Children. He went to the stove first, the way he always did when he came in from outside, crouching to build a fire from the birch bark and split kindling he kept in a box beside it. The flame caught quickly. Children. He added 2 split logs and closed the damper to draw it up. When he turned around, Sable had not moved from just inside the door. She was looking around the cabin. Taking inventory, he realized. Children. Noting the exits, counting the distances, he moved past her to hang up his coat. Children. He pulled out a chair at the table, the one nearest the stove, and pushed it slightly in her direction without comment, an offering rather than a command. Children. Then he went to the shelf and took down the bread he'd baked 2 days ago, a pot of preserves, a cured sausage. He set them on the table. "Sit," he said, and then caught himself and added, more quietly, "Children, if you want." She came to the table slowly. She sat on the edge of the chair, her weight forward, prepared to move. She looked at the food. "Children." Her hand went out toward the bread and then stopped, hovering, the way a person's hand stops when they've been punished enough times for reaching. "Go ahead," Emmett said, not looking at her. "Children." He was turned toward the shelf, pulling down 2 tin mugs, giving her the privacy of not being watched. He heard her take the bread. He put the kettle on and stood with his back to the room. "Children." Giving her time to eat without the discomfort of his attention. And he tried to understand what he had done tonight. "Children." He had paid $12 and brought home a woman he did not know, and now she was eating bread at his table, and he had absolutely no plan for what happened next. "Children." He was a man who built everything according to a plan. He had planned every beam of this cabin, every row of the kitchen garden, every cord of wood in the woodlot. "Children." He did not know what to do with things that fell outside of planning. Behind him he heard the chair scrape back. When he turned around, Sable was standing. "Children." She had untied the rope from her wrists, finally, and it was coiled on the table beside the bread. She was looking at him with that same dark-eyed steadiness. "Children." And she had set her jaw in a particular way he would come to recognize in the months ahead as the expression she wore when she was preparing for something she had decided was unavoidable. "Children." She reached up and began to unbutton the large coat. He realized it was the only outer layer she had. "What do you want from me?" she said. "Children." It was not a question either. It was the tone of a transaction being clarified before terms could be disputed. "Cook and clean, I can do that. I can split wood, I can work a garden." A pause. The coat hung open. "Children." Or the other thing, if that's what the $12 was for. She said it without inflection, the way you say the price of flour. "I just need to know. I don't do well with surprises." "Children." The last word dropped into the room like a stone into still water. "Children." Emmett stood with the kettle in his hand and felt something shift in the back of his throat that he didn't have a name for. "Children." He had grown up on a hardscrabble farm outside Thunder Bay with a father who communicated primarily through silence and a mother who had worked herself to a gray shadow before he was 12. "Children." He was not a man given to large emotion. He felt things in a delayed, underwater way, arriving at the shape of an experience long after it had passed. This arrived immediately. "Children." A bright, nauseating clarity. She wasn't afraid. That was the thing that undid him. She wasn't trembling or pleading or looking at the door. She had simply calculated the available options and arrived at what she had been taught was the only realistic one. And she was presenting it to him without drama, because drama had never helped her, and she had learned to conserve energy for things that actually mattered. "Children." He set the kettle down on the stove with a sound that was louder than he intended, and she flinched back, one step, her weight shifting to her back foot, her chin dropping slightly to protect her jaw. Emmett realized, with a cold, hollow feeling, that she had done that automatically, that her body had mapped the geometry of anticipated violence without her even thinking about it. He did not move toward her. "Children." He stood exactly where he was, both hands visible, and he waited until her breathing evened out. "Button your coat up," he said. His voice came out rough around the edges. "You're cold." She stared at him. "Children." "The $12 was for the rope around your wrists," he said. "Not for anything else. There's nothing else." He picked the kettle back up, turned to the stove. "Children." Because he needed something to do with his hands. "You can sleep in the back room. There's a bolt on the inside of the door." "Children." "You can use it." Silence. "I don't understand what you want," she said. Behind him, her voice had changed register, fractionally. "Just enough. I want you to drink some tea and warm up," he said. "Children." "That's all I want tonight." He heard her exhale. It was a long, slow, carefully controlled sound, the sound of a person deciding, against every learned instinct, to provisionally believe something. Children. He poured the tea, she buttoned the coat. Children. The first weeks were a negotiation conducted almost entirely without words. Sable woke before him every day, which he discovered when he came out of his room the second morning, to find the stove already going and a pot of oatmeal on the heat, and her standing at the window, with her hands wrapped around a mug, looking out at the frost on the birch trees. She had bolted her door the first night. Children. He had heard the heavy chunk of it sliding home, and he had gone to bed with a strange feeling in his chest that he eventually identified as relief. Not for himself, for her. She worked constantly. Children. He would ask her to stop, and she would nod and slow down, and then pick up the pace again within the hour, because her body didn't know how to be still without consequence. Children. She chopped wood with a competence that told him she'd been doing it since childhood. Children. She repaired the chinking between the logs in the north wall of the cabin with a mixture of mud and straw that she figured out herself. Children. Watching how the existing chinking was done and replicating it without asking. She did not ask for things. She watched, assessed, and acted. Children. She ate like someone who had trained herself to eat quickly and without pleasure in case the food was taken back. Emmett watched all of this without commenting on most of it. Children. He was not a man who knew how to say the kinds of things that might help, and he suspected that words were not what she needed most right now. What she needed most was evidence, accumulated slowly over time. Children. That the things he had said on the first night were true. He provided this evidence by doing nothing, by being, as far as possible, entirely predictable. Same time to bed, same time up, same quiet patterns. Children. Same food, same space between them. He never walked up behind her. Children. He always spoke before he rounded a corner. He left the lamp burning at night because she had told him, obliquely, that she didn't like the dark, and he didn't ask why. Children. In November he shot a deer and she helped him hang and dress it in the barn without being asked, working with the same quiet competence she brought to everything. Children. And when he glanced over and caught her expression, she was almost, not quite but almost, at ease. Children. The barn was cold and the work was hard, and she was focused entirely on what was in front of her, and for a moment he could see what she would have been like before all of it. Children. Before Aldous and the rope and whatever had come before Aldous. It made something ache behind his sternum that had no good outlet, so he went back to work and said nothing. In December, children. Snow came down serious and stayed. The lake road was impassable. Children. They were sealed in together, the two of them and the horses and the cow. Children. In the particular close quiet of a northern winter, where the world outside reduces itself to a white silence, so complete it feels like pressure, Sable began to talk more. Not about herself, not at first. Children. She talked about the work, about the garden she wanted to start in spring, about whether he had thought about getting chickens. Children. About the best way to pack the root vegetables in the cellar so they lasted through to April. Children. She talked about practical things with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned to keep conversation usefully narrow. But the register of it had changed. Children. The transactional flatness had softened by some small but measurable degree. Emmett answered her questions and asked a few of his own. He was careful. He did not push. Children. He had the patience of a man who had learned it from the land, which gave things back on its own schedule and punished impatience with crop failure and split knuckles. Children. One evening in late December, she told him about her brother. Unprompted, in the middle of skinning rabbits, as though the information simply needed to be somewhere outside herself, and she had decided his presence was adequate for the purpose. His name had been Owen. He had died of fever 4 years ago when she was 16 and he was 13. children. After that, there had been only her mother, and then not even that. And then the succession of hard circumstances that had finally deposited her at the end of Aldos's rope in Calloway's supply on a Thursday night in October. Emmett said, "I'm sorry about your brother." Sable said, "He was funny. He did impressions." A pause. "He could do a perfect moose call." Children. "He thought it was the funniest thing in the world." Emmett said, "That is pretty funny." And Sable, for the first time since he had known her, made a sound that was almost a laugh. It was a small, children, abbreviated thing, quickly swallowed, as though she had produced it by accident and wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. But it was real. Emmett looked back down at the rabbit he was skinning. He was, children, he realized, in a great deal of trouble. January came in hard, children. The temperature dropped to the kind of cold that was not weather anymore but geological fact. The world reorganized around the physics of freezing, children. The horses moved sluggishly and breathed great clouds of steam. The milk cow's production fell off entirely. The firewood went faster than Emmett had calculated, children, which meant more splitting in cold that turned his hands to clumsy blocks. Sable split wood alongside him without being asked. He didn't tell her not to, children. He had learned that telling her not to do things only transferred her energy into other tasks, with an urgency that wasn't good for either of them. On the 23rd of January, Patience began to scream, children. Emmett heard it from inside the cabin and was through the door with his rifle before he was fully conscious of moving, Sable 3 steps behind him. There were 2 men at the edge of the tree line, children. One of them was Aldous, children. Emmett felt the cold in a different way now, the cold of a situation contracting around him. Aldous had a companion with him, a narrow man on a thin horse, children, with a rifle resting across his saddle horn, with the practiced casualness of someone who had used it before for purposes other than game. Behind Emmett, he heard Sable's breathing change, children. A sharp involuntary catch that she immediately controlled, and that control, the effort of it, made his jaw tighten. "Pryce," Aldous said, children. He didn't bother with a greeting. "I've been thinking about that transaction in October. I don't think it was properly concluded." "It was concluded," Emmett said, children. Girl was leveraged against a debt that $12 didn't cover. Aldous' eyes moved to Sable, and the way they moved made Emmett step slightly to his left, putting more of himself between them. "Children, she comes back with me and we call it settled. She's not going anywhere." The narrow man on the thin horse shifted his rifle. "Children." Emmett had his own rifle, but his hands were cold and the angle was bad, and there were 2 of them and 1 of him, children. And he was running the arithmetic on this with the cold, focused part of his mind that managed emergencies when his chest was doing something loud and unhelpful. He didn't hear Sable move, children. What he heard was the click of his own revolver being cocked, a sound he knew precisely because he had cleaned that gun last Sunday on the kitchen table. He turned his head slightly, children. Sable had come out from behind him, and she was standing to his right with his revolver in both hands, weight forward, arms straight, children, in the stance of someone who had been taught to shoot by someone who knew what they were doing. Her face was the color of birch bark. Her hands were not shaking. She looked at Aldous. "You sold me," she said, children. Her voice was very quiet. "I'm sold. I don't belong to a debt anymore. I belong to myself." A pause. "Get off this property." Aldous looked at the gun, children, looked at her face, ran his own arithmetic. The narrow man on the thin horse went first, pulling his animal around without a word. Aldous held a moment longer, as men like Aldous always do, children, needing to give the impression that departure was their own idea. Then he went. The sound of hooves on hard-packed snow diminished into the trees, and then was gone. Emmett let out a breath, children. The cold air came back in, and he hadn't noticed he'd been holding it. Sable lowered the revolver, children. She held it for a moment, looking down at it, and then held it out to him, grip first. He took it. She turned around and walked back toward the cabin without looking at him. He followed her in. Children. The stove had cooled while they were outside, and the cabin was sharp with cold, and she went straight to it and fed in more wood, with hands that were finally, barely, trembling. Children. Emmett stood in the middle of the room. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" he said. Children. "My father before he left." She didn't look up from the stove. He wasn't good for much, but he was good for that. A silence. "You could have taken patience," Emmett said. He wasn't accusing her. Children. He was saying it because it was true, and because the truth of it had arrived in his chest with significant force. "When I went for the rifle, you could have taken her and gone." Children. Sable crouched in front of the stove. The fire was catching now, the birch bark curling orange. "I know," she said. Children. "Why didn't you?" She was quiet for long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. "Because you didn't leave me on the road," she said, finally. Her voice was level and facing away from him, directed at the fire, and the bolt on my door has never been tested. A pause. "And I know where the coffee is." It was not a declaration. Children. It was a woman telling him, in the most economical terms available to her, that she had made a calculation, and that the calculation had come out in his favor. That was all. Children. Emmett stood in his cabin in January in northern Ontario and felt the complicated, frightening weight of being trusted by someone who had excellent reasons not to trust anything. He sat down at the table. Children. He rubbed his face with both hands. "The chickens," he said after a while. Sable turned around from the stove. Children. She looked at him. "In spring," he said. "If you want chickens, we should order them by March, or they won't come until June." Something moved across her face. So quick he almost missed it. Not quite a smile. Children. The cousin of a smile. The suggestion that a smile was something her face was capable of, and might, in time, produce. "Rhode Island Reds," she said. "They do better in the cold." "All right," Emmett said. Children. Outside the wind was solid and mean off the lake. Inside the fire was going. Children. The coffee was where she said it was. The winter had a long way to go yet, and for the first time in longer than he could account for, Emmett Pryce was in no hurry for it to end.